In 705 AD, Lady Wang's screams echoed through the palace halls as guards wrapped her trembling body in layers of wet silk. But that wasn't even the worst part. What followed was so psychologically devastating that historians spent centuries trying to erase it from history. You see, this wasn't simple execution. It was a crafted ritual of humiliation, reserved exclusively for China's most privileged women. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why noble ladies would literally beg for a sword through the heart, rather than face what became known as the silk cocoon. In this video, you'll uncover 3 disturbing truths. First, why this horrifying method was used only on women of noble birth. Second, the twisted psychological reason it was considered worse than death itself. And third, how one ruthless empress turned this torture into a political weapon to eliminate her rivals. So before we begin, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear has been buried for over 300 years. And once you know, you'll never look at silk the same way again. Picture this. It's the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD, China's golden age. The Silk Road floods the empire with wealth. Art and poetry bloom. And for the first time in Chinese history, women begin to wield real political power. But here's the part your textbooks never mention. The same silk that symbolized a woman's beauty and status could also become her executioner. In Tang China, status was everything, but it wasn't measured in gold or titles. It was measured in honor, dignity, and face. For noble women, their reputation was sacred. Their virtue wasn't just personal, it represented their entire family's moral worth. So imagine, you are a high-ranking court lady. You wear the finest silk. You advise ministers. You dine beside poets and princes. Your world is refinement itself. And then, the very fabric that once caressed your skin becomes the weapon that will crush you alive. That was the terrifying genius of the silk torture. It used the most delicate material in the empire to erase a woman's identity in the most horrifying way possible. Here's how it worked. And I warn you, it gets dark. First, executioners would strip the victim completely bare, a humiliation worse than death in a culture built on modesty. Then they began to wrap her, layer after layer, in silk soaked with cold water. The fabric was smooth, almost gentle at first, clinging softly to the skin. But as it dried, it began to tighten, slowly, mercilessly. Silk fibers contract as moisture evaporates. Over hours, the wrapping turned into a living vise, compressing muscle, cutting off breath, crushing bone without spilling a drop of blood. Court records found in Buddhist monasteries describe how the victims stayed conscious for most of the process. They could feel the pressure rise with every breath. Fingers went blue, veins bulged, and the body stiffened as the silk cocoon shrank tighter and tighter. One ancient record quotes a noblewoman begging, "Please, use the sword. Do not let the silk take me." The horror was intentional. The Tang court wanted these women to die, not as rebels or traitors, but as symbols of obedience unmade. The silk, once their pride, became their punishment. Every thread a reminder that beauty, luxury, and privilege could be turned into instruments of control. But here's the darkest truth. The silk cocoon wasn't meant only to kill. It was meant to erase. In Confucian China, noble women represented grace, refinement, civilization itself. To destroy them physically wasn't enough. They had to be symbolically unmade. That's why this punishment was reserved exclusively for the elite. It wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle, about turning the empire's most honored women into public warnings. Each execution whispered the same message. Even silk obeys the emperor's will. So must you. And as for Lady Wang, her name appears in Tang court annals only once more. A short line written by a scribe centuries ago. She met the silk, no grave, no monument, no memory. Just the silence of a woman erased by the fabric that once defined her worth, by turning silk into a weapon. The executioners weren't merely killing a body, they were corrupting everything it symbolized. Silk, once the essence of elegance and grace, became an instrument of horror. Beheadings or hangings were swift. A noblewoman could die with her dignity intact. Her family could still grieve her as honorable, but silk torture was different. It stripped away dignity thread by thread, a slow, deliberate annihilation of body, soul, and status. Each layer of silk didn't just tighten around the flesh, it crushed identity, elegance, reputation. This was social murder as much as physical execution, and what made it even more terrifying, it was done in front of witnesses. According to Tang court documents recovered from monastery archives, other noblewomen were often forced to watch. They stood there, trembling in silence, as the victim gasped for air, her silk cocoon glistening in torchlight. The message could not have been clearer. Your silk, your wealth, your rank, all of it can become your undoing. The very fabric that once defined privilege became the tool of public obedience. But then came Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor, and the one who turned silk torture into something even more terrifying. Political assassination disguised as morality. Wu didn't invent silk torture. She perfected it. She weaponized it not as punishment, but as political theater. Her rule, 690-705 AD, challenged every Confucian law that said women must be submissive. And because of that, her enemies were everywhere, nobles, generals, scholars, and especially other women within the palace. But Wu was too clever for open violence. Executing rivals by sword or fire would make her look insecure. So she crafted something much more insidious. She framed her female opponents as morally corrupt, adulterers, seductresses, disloyal wives. And then, in the name of virtue, she ordered their deaths by silk cocoon. The message was pure psychological warfare. I don't kill out of fear. I kill out of righteousness. She didn't need to execute hundreds. The fear alone ruled her empire. The most infamous case, Lady Zhang, wife of Wu's own stepson, Crown Prince Li Xian. In 695 AD, Lady Zhang's charm and intelligence began winning her powerful friends at court, too many for Wu's liking. So Wu accused her of corruption, summoned the silk executioners, and turned the Crown Prince's wife into an example. Lady Zhang's last words were recorded by court scribes. "Your Majesty, I have served faithfully. Why must I die wrapped in shame?" Wu's response froze everyone present. The silk reveals your true nature, beautiful to see, deadly to power. Lady Zhang's death took 14 hours. For the first 4, Empress Wu ordered every woman of the court to stand and watch. Witnesses described her face, pale, silent, motionless, as the silk dried and constricted. That wasn't punishment. That was psychological domination. But Wu's cruelty didn't stop there. According to surviving Tang records, she used silk torture not just for executions, but for conditioning. It became her unspoken language of power. Just the rumor of silk was enough to make courtiers kneel and confess crimes they hadn't committed. And then came her most horrifying act, the punishment of her own daughter-in-law. What happened next revealed the true psychological genius behind this execution. Because this wasn't about pain, it was about awareness. Unlike other torture methods meant to force confessions, silk torture was meant to make victims watch their own death unfold. Silk doesn't crush instantly, it tightens slowly. The process could last 6 to 18 hours. Court records describe the dying women fully conscious, counting their own end thread by thread. One surviving account from a Buddhist archive quotes a victim whispering, "I can feel the 73rd thread cutting into my wrist. When the 100th tightens, I will no longer feel my hands." Imagine that. Knowing exactly when each breath will stop, unable to move, unable to scream, and realizing that your own luxury, your own silk, has become the executioner. That was the true horror. It wasn't just death. It was the destruction of identity, played out in slow motion. The silk would tighten in waves, sometimes fast, sometimes agonizingly slow, as humidity and temperature shifted through the night. That meant the victim never knew what was coming next. Would the next breath bring relief or agony? That uncertainty, that waiting, was the real torture. Each contraction became a cruel rhythm of hope and despair, twisting the mind long before it crushed the body. And always, the silk was white, pure, flawless white, the color of innocence, of virtue, of a woman's honor in Chinese culture. So even as it suffocated them, the victims were surrounded by the visual symbol of everything they were meant to embody: purity, grace, obedience. But now that purity had become their executioner, multiple records describe noblewomen begging for traditional death instead. A blade, an axe, even fire, anything but the slow, silent cruelty of silk. One Tang court record captures a final plea that still chills historians. Lady Chen wept and pleaded for the executioner's blade, saying, "Let me die as a warrior, not as prey caught in a spider's web." Her wish was denied. Silk torture was so psychologically devastating that when the Tang Dynasty fell in 907 AD, the method nearly vanished from history. Not because it was inhumane, China had countless brutal punishments, but because it worked too well. It didn't just destroy the condemned. It scarred everyone who witnessed it. Even hardened soldiers and court officials were said to suffer nightmares for weeks after watching. When the Song dynasty rose to power, silk torture was deliberately banned and the records sealed. Buddhism's growing influence helped erase it further, because Buddhist teaching demanded that suffering serve a purpose: redemption, enlightenment, or justice. Silk torture served none. It existed only to annihilate identity, to turn beauty into a weapon, and to make obedience seem like mercy. By the time historians rediscovered monastic archives in the 1970s, they were stunned to find detailed accounts, measurements, techniques, and even the names of victims, proving that this nightmare had been real for centuries. It had survived only as a whisper in dark legends, until the truth was unwrapped once more. And that truth was horrifying. Silk torture wasn't just an execution. It was a message, a demonstration of how patriarchal power could take something beautiful and make it monstrous. How luxury, status, and elegance could be twisted into instruments of control. But here's where it becomes disturbingly familiar. The psychology behind silk torture didn't die with ancient China. Its essence, the act of turning someone's strength into their weakness, still exists today, when power uses beauty, fame, or pride as tools of manipulation. When society turns your voice, your identity, your confidence into a reason to shame you. That's the same playbook, modernized, digital, and psychological, because oppression evolves. Only the methods change. As history has shown us, the most refined tools of control are always disguised as elegance. So the next time you feel silk between your fingers, remember, once it was a weapon, once it was death itself, and once it reminded every woman under heaven that even the softest fabric could become the sharpest chain. Subscribe for more untold stories from history's darkest corners, because the most beautiful surfaces often hide the darkest secrets.